Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to discuss Giambattista Vico's The New Science, published in 1725. This is one of the earliest and most significant systematic attempts at a philosophy of history, in which Vico attempts to find a series of common conceptual undercurrents which allow for the development of society. He's going to locate a number of central institutions and in so doing discover a history of ideas developing through human civilization by which the condition of civility can come about. And for him, this is going to be deeply embedded in a civil theology, by which he discusses the manifestation of God's will and power in history as the precondition by which we can come to things like language and government. Now, I must preface this by saying that Vico's account is rather Eurocentric, trying to make a distinction between the uncivilized pagans of the past and the civilized Christians of the present. And he tries to make a distinction whereby we can see the development from uncivility to civility and figure out what this means for government, for the value of myth and story, and especially etymology. Vico is going to try to figure out how the development of language and institutions essentially reveals a conceptual framework which works through history, very similar to the way Hegel conceives of reason, with a capital R, as a sort of undercurrent that allows for the development of historical moments. He writes, "My new science, or new metaphysics, discovers the origins of divine and human institutions in the pagan nations. And on the basis of these origins, my science establishes a system of the natural law of the nations, which progresses with great regularity and consistency in all three ages through which the Egyptians said they had passed in the entire course of world history. And these three ages are the age of gods, of heroes, and of men. And this threefold cycle, which is going to recur over and over because there's going to be a fourth part, which is called the ricorso, or the ricorsi in the plural. And this is going to lead to a development basically from uncivility through to democracy, and then at the point of democracy, very similar to Plato, this is going to result in a series of factions developing and a proclivity to value personal liberty above all else, and it's going to lead to anarchy and going back into a state of primitiveness. And he's going to track the development of authority of institutions through these 3 or 4 different ages, depending on how you want to count them. And the way Vico frames this is we start out basically in a Hobbesian state of nature, where it's every man against every other man, and there is a need for some sort of social order, because society helps us do things. It helps us build economies and connections and do things we wouldn't be able to do all on our lonesome. And one of the ways that we do this for Vico is by starting with alliances of fear. We fear a common thing, which is nature and the unknown in all of its gargantuanness. And this is typified by thunder for Vico. He says that thunder and lightning became some of the first gods, typified in the god of Jupiter. And in response to the fear of nature, we all bow down and actually flee from this force and go into caves, and we start families. So important for Vico is that the thunderclap starts history by instantiating fear into history and creating a need for social cohesion, which leads us to choose mates. And this starts the age of the gods, in which the gods are the principal authority figure. This is then going to be usurped by the age of heroes, whereby we have certain leaders which come to take the authority of the gods. They are seen as having their authority bestowed by the gods, but nevertheless they become the principal sort of political emissaries. Then we go to the age of men, where we enter democratization. We start to move from monarchy to aristocracy, and then we are going to move eventually to democracy later in the age of men. And when we hit the ricorso, this is basically all going to collapse and shit is going to hit the fan. Now, important for understanding the new science and its place in the history of philosophy is the prevalence it gives to ideas as the movers of history. Sure, we are constrained by our material conditions, but the things that allow for us to progress from uncivility to civility is the progression through these conceptually categorized ages. And these move forward by people actually making fundamental paradigm shifts in the way they comport themselves towards their ideas. As such, he's going to be concerned with the way that human creativity manifests itself and develops over time, stating, as a particular aspect of the divine age, mythology relates that the gods mingled with men on earth. In order to ensure the certainty of my principles of chronology, my new science envisions a natural theogony. This means a genealogy of the gods as naturally formed in the imagination of the Greeks on certain occasions, when they perceived that institutions necessary or useful to humankind had relieved or assisted them in the early childhood of the world. So, the function of mythology is primarily a way, first off, of comporting societies as groups to the world in which they find themselves, and also a function of narrative, of a fabulatory function by which we create a sort of framing narrative in which we can fit our communities. And from this, we get fables, which then get repeated down the ages, and thereby we have the insurance of posterity and of our society as a unique group. And it's important that throughout the new science, Vico is going to ground his work in a philosophically inflected philology and in a philological inflected philosophy. He's trying to blend these two together, try to see a series of concepts which we would get in theory, in philosophy, as confirmed by their historical instantiation. So we can't think of philosophy as some high-in-the-sky discipline of metaphysics. He says, no, that's actually kind of beyond the pale of what our minds can really do. We can only talk about metaphysics in very general terms. If we really want to understand how can we develop and move forward in the world, we have to understand the way we interact with particulars which are manifested in history, and thus is the job of philology. Thus, he's going to try to ground his theory in etymologies, in the development of language, because he sees this as the central refuse of our concepts and ideas. Thus, he writes, all of these notes make clear that everything we know about the ancient pagan nations in the period shown on my table, and he says that we primarily have authoritative accounts of these pagan nations through the Greeks, is completely uncertain. I have entered what is virtually unclaimed territory, in which the law grants rights to the occupant, occupanti conceduntur. Hence, I believe I am violating no one else's rights if my account of the origins of national civilizations differs from and even contradicts those of previous scholars. For I am seeking scientific principles which will explain the origins of certain known historical facts and give them a solid and coherent historical basis. For in previous studies they have revealed no common foundation, no continuity of sequence, and no coherence among themselves. So this is a very important project, and this is a very significant paragraph in understanding the history of philosophy, because we're seeing a very decisive break here in which history grounds itself in the necessity of coherence. In order to understand the facts of the past, we have to be able to take all the disparate phenomena that have occurred and put them into a coherent system. And for Vico, this requirement of coherence is going to entail that he departs from the authority of previous scholars who tended to be restricted by, for example, the conceit of nations, which is a great concept he has, whereby nations tend to privilege themselves as the bearer of everything great and everyone else as the bearer of everything else not great. Now, it's rather strange that Vico seems to typify this conceit of nations because he himself is convinced that Christian civilization is the apex of civilization as such, and the pagans and the Muslims and all of this are the basically antinomies of civilization. So although he himself is typifying in a very ironic way, or perhaps an ignorant way, the conceit of nations, he is showing his willful divergence in accounting for history, that our ideas must essentially be put into a narrative whole. We must be able to tell a coherent story of the past in order for it to be a history as such. So it's not simply tabulating a series of ideas, but it's also the ability to make those ideas cohere together in a common system. Thus, we can see why this is an attempt at a systematic account of history, the likes of which we get in Hegel. He says that the human mind naturally tends to take delight in what is uniform, and thereby it's going to try to create a history of ideas which conforms with what makes sense to them. Thus, living in a certain context, he says, these people of the past create myths which are appropriate to these conditions. I think this is a very significant development whereby we're seeing through his natural theogony that he's essentially understanding gods as serving a fabulatory function, as being part of a narrative impetus by which we make sense of ourselves. And after developing a series of axioms and establishing principles, he says that Axiom 48 proves that the earliest men, as the children of the human race, were unable to conceive rational categories of things, and thus felt a natural need to invent poetic archetypes. These archetypes were imaginative categories or universals, to which, like ideal models or portraits, men could assign all the particular species that resemble them, and by virtue of this resemblance, ancient myths were invented with propriety. Right? So there's an inventive quality to the very first means by which we try to structure a common communal identity through the relationship to the past that seems essentially national and unique to a nation. And it's important to caveat here that this is a notably patronizing account of the past, right? The children of the human race are those of the past. And we, the great European Christians, are the adults, those who have come into the resplendent light of the truth. It's very infantilizing. And he's often going to talk of past peoples as being fundamentally different in their capacities to use certain concepts. And thereby, we cannot orient our minds to ourselves the same way we can to them because they thought differently. And in a sense, this is an important consideration, that fundamentally different historical periods have different ways of using concepts, and that concepts can't always be transmuted from age to age without some amount getting lost in translation. But it also has the unfortunate consequence of making this a teleological development, whereby we go from worse to better. And the concepts of the past are worse, less developed and rarefied, and the contemporary is formal and complex, right? It gives the illusion that everyone, just because they're in a newer time period, is therefore smarter, which is not necessarily true at all. Sure, there are a number of institutions that aid in the development of these smarts, but that doesn't categorically make our cognitive capacities better than those of our forefathers. But central to Vico's theory is understanding human sociality, that we essentially comport ourselves towards ideas which are communally mediated. Thus, in a noteworthy simile, he says, Dio Chrysostomum says that custom is like a king and law like a tyrant. The implication of this axiom decides the great debate whether law exists in nature or in human opinion, which is the same question posed into the corollary of Axiom 8, whether human nature is sociable. So he's trying to figure out, are we fundamentally social creatures? And he says, the natural law of nations was established by custom, which Dio compares to a king commanding by pleasure, rather than by law, which Dio compares to a tyrant commanding by force. This natural law was born of human customs, which sprang from the common nature of nations, which is the universal subject of my science. And this natural law preserves human society, for there is nothing more natural, because more pleasing, than observing natural customs. Consequently, human nature, which is the source of human customs, is sociable. So we can see that this idea of natural law is a function of human customs. We create what we see as essential in human development and action. And nevertheless, Vico is going to try to say, and I'm really not sure of the validity of this, that behind human custom is a fundamental human nature, a commonality to all humans, which among other things is our sociality, which acts as the basis by which we can enter a common historical development, that we can see ideas develop in various paradigms that connect to each other in a temporal sequence. This is one of the more incisive passages for understanding the tenuous relationship that Vico has to the idea of civility and human nature, because it seems that at times he acknowledges the constructed nature of our concepts, that they are fundamentally creations, as his explication of mythology goes, that it is fundamentally a created narrative way to talk about the lived reality of peoples, the things that they fear, that they aspire to be. He writes, still in the dense and dark night which envelops remotest antiquity, there shines an eternal and inextinguishable light. It is the truth which cannot be doubted, that the civil world is certainly the creation of humankind, i.e. that it doesn't just drop from the sky, but that if anything, it is a combination between the revelation of divine providence and the capacities immanent in this world of humans who create institutions and develop ideas. And consequently, he continues, the principles of the civil world can and must be discovered within the modifications of the human mind. So the history of the development of ideas. This is very incisive for understanding Hegel. If we reflect on this, we can only wonder why all the philosophers have so earnestly pursued a knowledge of the world of nature, which only God can know as its creator, while they neglected to study the world of nations, or the civil world, which people can in fact know because they created it. The cause of this paradox is that infirmity of the human mind noted in 63. Because it is buried deep within the body, the human mind naturally tends to notice what is corporeal and must make a great and laborious effort to understand itself, just as the eye sees all external objects, but needs a mirror to see itself. So this is very Platonic in the way he's talking about a dialectic that involves analyzing the historical development of ideas and thereby the notion of humankind, of civility, of reason and rationality. And in attempting to sketch a sort of common grammar or logic by which society develops, he says that we observe that the barbarous and civilized nations of the world, despite their great separation in space and time and their separate foundations, all share these three human customs, which is all have some religion, and he sees this as the proof of the historical revelation and presence of divine providence. Second, all contract solemn marriages, which he sees as the proof of the family as the fundamental social unit. And third, all bury their dead, which he sees as the proof of the eternal nature of the human spirit. And thus, the notion of humanity is constantly, recursively developing itself through history. In every nation, no matter how savage and crude, no rites are celebrated with more elaborate ceremonies or more sacred solemnities than those of religion, marriage, and burial. So he's trying to find some sort of common conceptual vocabulary that we use to frame our actions. Thus, the philosophers, he says, have made a fundamental error by avoiding the historical development of these concepts. He says that the philosophers should have discussed providence as revealed in the economy of civil institutions. This is clear from the proper meaning of the word divinity, which was applied to providence. This noun derives from the Latin verb divinare, to divine. In other words, to understand either what is hidden from men, meaning the future, or what is hidden within them, meaning their conscience. All right? So this idea of the future, of the unfolding of ideas, of a sense of becoming that Hegel is going to develop, and this idea of conscience, of a developing historical consciousness, which is going to become, for Hegel, self-consciousness, and thus the resplendent truth of the development of a dialectical unfolding of Geist, of spirit, for Hegel. My new science, he says, is therefore a demonstration, as it were, of providence as a historical fact. That is, it must provide a history of the orders and institutions which provide bestowed on the great polity of humankind, without the knowledge or advice of humankind, and often contrary to human planning. For although by its creation our world is temporal and particular, the orders which providence establishes in it are universal and eternal. So essentially, governing and managing the immense variety of experiences, ideas, and peoples is a series of definite orders, which are these, ages of the divine, the heroic, and mankind, which are going to frame the historical development of our species and thus of civility itself. Now, there's a lot more that I could say about this. He's going to talk about the development of language from monosyllabic grunts and song as well, and its relationship to mythology. There's some interesting stuff in here, and a lot of it we know now is incorrect. A lot of his etymologies are wrong. They are, in fact, made up. But I think that there's a slight magic in this, which is that we're seeing break in the way we conceive of history from a simple tabulation of facts to a conception of narrative and coherence that blends us through a development of ideas that are recursively and self-reflexively understanding their relationship to the past and the future. So I think that this is a very incisive moment in the history of philosophy and in the philosophy of history, and I hope that this has been helpful in understanding Vico. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat helpful. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic lit. I also have a channel membership you can join for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you just like to make a one-time donation to the channel, because it helps me purchase the many books required to bring content, but no pressure. Care about yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.